I stood on a street corner in Manchester the other day, and I was watching a demolition crew tear into the side of this stunning 19th century Gothic cathedral.
Oh, wow.
It was.
So
It was a visceral scene. You could hear the grinding stone, see these clouds of, centuries-old dust just choking the air.
right.
And standing next to me was this young urban planner holding a tablet, and he looked almost giddy.
Giddy.
Yeah, he taps the screen and shows me the upgrade, and it's a rendering of a sleek, just soulless glass and steel high-rise that was going to go right there.
Of course.
He points at the crumbling stone and says, "Finally, we're shedding the dead weight. This city needs to stop living in the past if it wants a future." To him, you see, the destruction wasn't a loss. It was like a necessary sanitation, a clearing of the board.
Just a technical problem to be solved.
Exactly. But then the wrecking ball swung again, and it shattered the stained glass window that had survived 2 world wars.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
And the mood just shifted for me. The planner's excitement about efficiency suddenly felt so small, almost childish. And it struck me that I was witnessing exactly what G.K. Chesterton warned us about, a culture of repudiation.
Right.
This wasn't just construction. It was a coup. It was the arrogant oligarchy of the living, silencing the voices of the past simply because they aren't here to argue back. And it just begs the question, why do we assume the only vote that matters is cast by those who just happen to be walking around right now?
The democracy of the dead gets no say.
None at all. And that opening sentiment, that idea of the arrogant oligarchy of the living, is exactly what we are diving into today.
Yeah.
Our mission is to move beyond, the philosophical debate, the feelings of nostalgia and regret,
Yeah.
and to actually explore the quantifiable costs.
The real numbers.
Yeah.
Economic, social.
Economic, social, and geopolitical costs of systematically dismissing this ancestral wisdom of dismantling traditional institutions. We are going to trace the consequences of this repudiation, from the collapse of community resilience right up to direct threats against international security.
It's a huge scope.
It is. And you might be surprised to find out that the decline of, say, a local fraternal organization 50 years ago is directly linked to the stability of global markets today.
It's all connected, and I think it's crucial to understand that we're dealing with measurable decay here, not just, subjective feelings of loss.
Exactly.
When we talk about these institutions being dismantled, the most vital asset that gets destroyed is often, it's invisible. It's the bedrock of a functional society that economists and sociologists call social capital.
Okay, so let's unpack that term social capital, because it sounds a little bit like academic jargon, but it's actually, like you said, the operating system of a successful community.
Absolutely. Social capital, as researchers have defined it, is built on features of social organization. So we're talking about the norms, the networks, and the levels of social trust that exist among citizens.
The intangible stuff.
The intangible assets, exactly. The things that facilitate coordination and cooperation among people for their mutual benefit.
So we could think of it with a simple analogy, right? If physical capital is, say, the tools and machinery you own, a trust or a factory, and human capital is your training and your skills, like knowing how to drive that truck.
Right, your education.
Then social capital is the quality of the traffic system, the relationships, the shared understanding that lets you use those tools effectively without needing, a full police escort every time you go to the store.
Precisely. It's the lubricant that minimizes friction. It enhances both individual and collective productivity.
So things just work better.
Things get done faster, cheaper, and with a lot less litigation or need for these incredibly complex contracts. You find that successful outcomes, whether you're talking about education, economic development, or controlling crime, are just demonstrably more likely in these civically engaged, high-trust communities.
And we have to remember, historically, the United States was the global gold standard for this. I mean, you look at Alexis de Tocqueville observing the young nation back in the 1830s. He was just profoundly struck by Americans' extraordinary propensity for forming civic associations.
For everything.
For everything.
Religious, moral, commercial, social, you name it. He saw this intense civic spirit, this constant networking, as the essential ingredient that allowed American democracy to actually function, despite its vastness and diversity.
And that's the context for the crisis we're in now. If we were once the global benchmark, the data that shows the systematic decline of American civil society over the past several decades is,
it's alarming.
It's more than alarming.
This erosion is so significant that it has demonstrably moved the U.S. lower in international rankings of social capital. We're basically watching the lubricant dry up in real time.
Let's get into the raw data then. Let's map this vanishing glue, because the numbers aren't minor shifts. They really do reveal a quantitative collapse in how we engage with our neighbors and our government.
Okay, so take political participation. We often focus on, presidential elections, but the broader picture is stark. Voter turnout in national elections declined by nearly a quarter since the high point in the early 1960s.
A quarter.
A quarter. That simple act of collective responsibility has just been forsaken by tens of millions of people. But the withdrawal, it goes much deeper than the ballot box.
Right. If we look at direct local engagement, the decline in that kind of grassroots democratic oversight is even sharper. The number of Americans reporting that they attended a public meeting on town or school affairs in the previous year, that fell by more than a third between 1973 and 1993.
More than a third.
Just think about what that means. It means a massive drop in the accountability of local school boards, of town councils, because fewer people are showing up to scrutinize the decisions that directly affect their property values and their children's education.
And this political and civic withdrawal is directly reflected in a psychological one. You see this pervasive lack of faith in the institutions of government.
The trust numbers.
The trust numbers are staggering. The proportion of Americans who reported that they trust the government in Washington only some of the time, or almost never, rose steadily from just 30% in 1966 to a staggering 75% by 1992.
Wow.
This withdrawal of generalized trust is maybe the single clearest hallmark of declining social capital.
And then we get to the organizational membership collapse, which hits at the very networks that Tocqueville praised.
Yeah.
These organizations were the physical hubs where trust was generated and maintained.
Right. Look at labor unions. They were once these massive engines of social solidarity and political engagement.
A huge part of the social fabric.
Membership has more than halved since its peak in the mid-1950s. It fell from 32.5% down to just 15.8% by 1992. The union hall, which, it provided insurance, community support, political education, a whole social safety net. For many people now, it's just a dusty, fading memory.
And the decline is pervasive. It's across every type of traditional associational life. I mean, consider the Parent-Teacher Association, the PTA.
Right, the PTA.
This isn't just about school bake sales, right? It's an essential form of social capital that creates shared norms about parenting and educational expectations across an entire community.
Absolutely.
And participation just dropped drastically. It went from over 12 million members in 1964 to barely 7 million by the time this research was done. That represents a fragmentation of shared educational values.
And you see the same with fraternal groups. The ones that provided social structure and mutual aid for men, they also saw these substantial drops. The Lions Club was off 12% since 1983.
And the Masons?
The Masons, with their rich history of local philanthropy and mutual support, were down 39% since 1959. I mean, these declines weren't just a failure to grow. They erased the social and civic gains made in the entire post-war era.
Traditional women's groups, which played such an essential role in advocacy and local improvement, they fared no better. The National Federation of Women's Clubs was down 59% since 1964.
59%.
The League of Women Voters was off 42% since 1969. Even just serious, regular volunteering, the non-structured giving of time that saw roughly a 1/6 decline between 1974 and 1989. These are just the comprehensive losses across the entire spectrum of civil society. It shows that the very mechanism of cooperation is decaying.
And that's why the whimsical, yet deeply telling example of bowling alone became the iconic shorthand for this entire phenomenon.
It's a perfect metaphor. It really is. The data show that between 1980 and 1993, the total number of people who bowled actually increased by 10%.
So more people were bowling.
More people were bowling. They still enjoy the activity.
Yeah.
But the number of people participating in organized league bowling plummeted by 40%.
40%.
So you have more people bowling than ever before, nearly 80 million people, which is more than voted in a lot of midterm elections. But they are bowling solo. They're isolated.
And the profound significance lies in what the league actually represents. The research highlights that league bowlers consumed 3 times the amount of beer and pizza of solo bowlers.
Chuckles, right.
But the real cost isn't measured in the declining revenue for the bowling lane, proprietors. It's measured in the massive loss of social interaction, of structured teamwork, accountability, and all those spontaneous civic conversations that happen when neighbors meet up weekly to compete in a low-stakes environment.
That loss is the vanishing social externality. When you bowl in a league, you're contributing to the social fabric just by showing up.
Yes.
When you bowl alone, you satisfy only your individual interests, and the community gains nothing from it.
Exactly. When you eliminate these physical meeting points, the PTA meeting, the union hall, the bowling league, you also eliminate the mechanisms through which norms of reciprocity and generalized trust are constantly reinforced.
Okay, so the evidence is overwhelming, the decline is real, but the big question is why? Why is this happening? When we look at the potential causes, they often seem contradictory or, I don't know, insufficient to explain the scale of this collapse.
Well, we can dismiss some of the initial theories fairly quickly. For example, the movement of women into the labor force. That certainly contributed to declines in historically women-heavy groups like the PTA.
Sure, that makes sense.
But the data clearly shows that the aggregate declines in participation for men were virtually as great as those for women. So this suggests it's a societal shift, not just a gender one.
And what about the repotting hypothesis, the idea that Americans are just moving around too much to set down roots?
That's another one that's directly contradicted by the data. Residential stability actually rose modestly since 1965.
So we were moving less.
We were slightly less mobile during the period of the sharpest civic decline, so it wasn't mobility breaking our communities. Something was actively eroding them while we were staying put.
Okay, so what else is at play?
Well, there are general demographic transformations. You've got fewer marriages, lower real wages for young men, things that undermine the traditionally stable middle-class parental structures that historically fueled civic engagement.
Right.
And on top of that, you have the replacement of local community enterprises, the corner hardware store, the locally owned grocery, with these multinational chain firms and electronic shopping. That undermines the physical basis for civic interaction. The physical common ground is literally paved over.
But the strongest instrument of change, the factor that correlates most strongly with the decline of all this associational life, is the technological transformation of leisure, and specifically, the rise of television.
Television is the ultimate privatizing force. Time budget studies from the 1960s onward showed that the growth in time spent watching television just eclipsed all other changes in how Americans spent their time. It fundamentally redefined leisure from a collective, public activity.
Going to a play, joining a club.
To an individual, private one. This technology made our shared social experiences wider, but also much, much shallower.
Okay, here's where I have to push back a little bit, because these studies, they predate the modern internet. So if TV was the culprit that privatized leisure, surely the internet, social media, digital communities, don't those count as new forms of social capital? Couldn't we argue that people are now participating in these vast non-geographic bowling leagues online?
That's a crucial question, but the research suggests there's a critical distinction to be made. While online networks can generate what we call bonding capital, so strong ties among homogenous groups.
People who are already like you.
Exactly. They often fail to generate the vital bridging capital. That's the weak ties among diverse groups that traditional physical organizations provided. The League of Women Voters brought together people who might disagree on policy but shared a physical community.
And online forums.
They often just amplify existing homogeneity. They provide very few of the spontaneous, localized civic interactions that feed trust. The transition from vaudeville to movies to the VCR and now to social media, it's technology driving a wedge, prioritizing the individual interest in entertainment satisfaction over the collective interest in maintaining positive social externalities.
So the quantifiable loss isn't just about membership fees. It's about the economic payoff of trust that vanishes when these norms of cooperation are no longer reinforced. Why should the average person care that their neighbor trusts them less?
The economic payoff of trust is profound and pervasive. As the Nobel laureate economist Kenneth Arrow famously noted, virtually every commercial transaction has within itself an element of trust. When trust is high, when you believe your neighbor, your vendor, and your government will operate under shared norms, economic activities are accomplished at a vastly lower cost.
Give me a tangible example of that lowered cost. What does that look like?
Well, when trust is high, you see significantly less litigation. Fewer resources are wasted in courts fighting over broken deals. You need fewer resources diverted to self-protection. Think fewer security guards, fewer armored trucks, less insurance against fraud.
That's corruption.
Certainly less corruption and fewer bribes. Contract specifications can be dramatically simpler because the parties rely on shared implicit norms of civic cooperation rather than needing thousands of pages detailing every possible contingency.
That makes perfect sense. The cost of mistrust is bureaucracy, lawyers, and security guards.
And furthermore, high trust influences long-term national economic policy. In high-trust societies, policy pronouncements by governments are perceived as more credible.
So people believe what they're told.
This credibility means businesses and citizens can adopt production technologies and investment strategies that are optimal over the long run, rather than just the immediate short run. They trust the central bankers and finance ministers not to arbitrarily, expropriate assets or change tax laws on a whim. Trust is the foundation of long-term planning.
Which brings us directly to governance and the crucial link between social capital and long-term public investment, particularly in something like human capital, like education.
This is where the mechanisms get really interesting. We find compelling empirical evidence that social capital, specifically the social diffusion of information, which is just people actively talking with friends and colleagues about what's going on politically and civically.
The bowling league conversations.
The bowling league conversations, they directly raise long-run economic growth by improving government performance.
How exactly does talking to your neighbor about local affairs make the government invest more in future growth? What's the connection there?
It addresses what researchers call myopic political incentives. See, the benefits of human capital investment, like building a great high school or funding long-term scientific research, are long-term.
They take decades to pay off.
Right. They're often not immediately visible to the public. They pay off 15 or 20 years down the line. This creates a powerful political incentive for governments to underinvest in these areas and instead favor public services with immediate, obvious, short-term benefits.
Like fixing potholes or increasing short-term welfare payments. Things that deliver votes right now.
Exactly. Politicians are incentivized to optimize for the 4-year electoral cycle, not for the next 40 years.
Right.
However, when citizens have a greater social diffusion of information, they overcome this electoral myopia. They become better informed voters, which improves the selection of politicians and enhances politicians' incentives to invest in public education, which then raises long-run economic growth for the entire society.
So the breakdown of those local networks, the decline in trust and local information sharing. It means fewer citizens are informed enough to demand that long-term, non-immediate investment, which then hobbles the future growth path of the entire economy. It's like an invisible tax imposed by our social negligence.
That's a great way to put it.
We are sacrificing our children's future prosperity for the political convenience of the present.
That is the direct economic consequence of dismissing the wisdom that functional governance requires active, informed participation. And that participation starts in the local community center, not just during election season.
We've mapped the physical evidence of this collapse, the data showing we trust less, we engage less. But what's the root cause? That physical void seems to be a reflection of a philosophical emptiness. It's what the philosopher Roger Scruton described as the culture of repudiation.
The active dismissal of the past.
Which leads to the rise of the oligarchy of the living.
And Carl Trueman elaborates on this beautifully. He argues that honoring tradition isn't about being resistant to change or, clinging mindlessly to the past. It's about profound intellectual and moral humility.
Yeah, humility.
Yes. It requires recognizing our own chronological snobbery. That's the truly arrogant belief that we, living today with all our modern knowledge, are somehow morally or intellectually superior to all previous generations who faced far greater trials than we have.
He characterizes ancestral traditions not as relics or inconvenient rules, but as, I love this phrase, hard-won survival manuals.
Yes.
Manuals gleaned from past trials, plagues, wars, social collapses, systemic dangers that we in the West have largely been insulated from for the last century. Why would any rational society discard the instruction manual written in blood by those who survived the worst systemic crises in human history?
It is the ultimate expression of short-sighted hubris. To assume that experience spanning thousands of years can be dismissed in favor of data drawn purely from the last 50 years, a period often characterized by technological disruption and social breakdown.
We see the direct costs of this repudiation in urban planning, in the dismantling of the physical structures that embody that wisdom. I keep thinking about that Manchester demolition anecdote, the 19th century cathedral torn down for a soulless glass high-rise.
The urban planner saw sanitation, the local historian saw destruction.
And the historian's quote is just haunting. He said, "They are not just tearing down stone, they are tearing down a story. The new building will be a monument to nothing but our own moment, a memory hole in the heart of the city."
It's the most vivid expression of the oligarchy of the living, asserting dominance and chronological snobbery over the democracy of the dead.
And there's another powerful localized example that really illustrates the destruction of that invisible social capital, tied directly to this obsession with modernization. It's the story of Arthur, a hardware store owner in the English Midlands.
This anecdote, it reveals the true nature of intergenerational wealth, which is so often not financial, but relational.
Exactly. Arthur's hardware store, which had been in his family for 3 generations, was far more than just a place to buy nails and paint.
It was a hub, a center of operational social trust. Arthur kept a handwritten ledger of tabs for neighbors who were temporarily short on cash until payday.
He was basically an informal bank.
An informal, decentralized welfare system built on decades of mutual relationships. He provided credit based on personal knowledge and community trust.
So when the local council, obsessed with urban renewal and maximizing technical land value, bulldozed that block, what happened to Arthur?
Well, Arthur was compensated handsomely for his physical building, but the social capital, that invaluable ledger of trust, the invisible infrastructure that guaranteed local resilience, was entirely erased.
That had no value on the balance sheet.
None. The new mixed-use glass complex brought in chain stores that offered technical efficiency. You could swipe your credit card easily, but they offered zero social cohesion. They had automated checkouts, strict corporate policies, and security guards. They were completely incapable of replicating Arthur's ledger of trust.
And the predictable consequence followed, which really confirms the economic thesis of social capital. 5 years later, the crime rate in that immediate neighborhood spiked.
Of course it did.
The lack of eyes on the street, the erasure of that informal system of welfare and social monitoring, it shattered community resilience. The shiny new architecture masked a profound destruction of intergenerational wealth and social cohesion.
They measured the technical compensation for the physical building, but they completely ignored the immense value of the human bonds they were tearing down. They optimized for the balance sheet of the current moment and destabilized the long-term safety and well-being of the entire community.
And this act of repudiation is being internalized by the next generation, often intentionally facilitated by our institutions. We read about the father, David, and his daughter, Sophie, at Thanksgiving dinner.
Right.
Sophie, newly returned from a prestigious university, viewed her coal mining grandfather's traditional values and the institutions he built, his church, his union, not as a heritage, but as merely engines of oppression and coded prejudices.
And David's heartbreaking realization was this sense of anomie. It's a profound sociological state defined by a lack of moral continuity and social connection.
He looked at his own daughter and felt she was a stranger.
Separated from him and his past by this impenetrable philosophical gulf. When education becomes a tool to actively sever the link between generations, rather than strengthening it through shared knowledge, the foundation of society becomes incredibly fragile.
If we raise an entire generation to see their whole inheritance, their churches, their architecture, their foundational stories, their cultural values, as intrinsically shameful, we should not be surprised when it feels zero responsibility to preserve it or pass it on.
They've been taught to disdain the democracy of the dead. It makes them perfect subjects for the tyranny of the contemporary moment. They lack the anchor of history, and the consequence of that philosophical and social collapse is fragility in the face of systemic crisis. Which brings us to history, because history provides these stark, enduring lessons in what happens when societies lack the resilience required to endure systemic shocks.
So let's turn our attention to the Bronze Age collapse, around 1177 BC. This wasn't just one single event. This was a total systemic failure of a highly complex, interconnected, internationalized world.
That period marks the end of the Late Bronze Age. Suddenly, many of these large, centralized empires and kingdoms across the Mediterranean and the Near East Mycenaean Greece, the Hittites, Egypt, was severely weakened. They fell like dominoes.
And what caused it?
Well, archaeological evidence suggests it was a confluence of interconnected calamities, a perfect storm. You have severe climate change, prolonged drought leading to famine, earthquakes, invasions by the mysterious sea peoples, and disease outbreaks.
So any one of those might have been survivable.
Exactly. None of them alone would have been sufficient, but together they proved fatal to these elaborate civilizations that had built their entire existence around centralized palace architecture and complex global trade routes.
But the key lesson here, drawn from archaeological research by scholars like Eric Klein, is that this wasn't total apocalypse. It was a period of winnowing decay and renewal.
Yes, that's the crucial point. Some civilizations utterly vanished. The Mycenaean palace culture was essentially wiped off the map. But others, against the odds, endured, and some even flourished. They proved to be anti-fragile.
So the critical question for us today is, are we the fragile Mycenaeans who collapsed under the weight of their own complexity, or are we the resilient Phoenicians? The contrast really highlights the attributes you need to endure chaos.
It does.
What specifically made the Phoenician model so resilient? And what does that tell us about rejecting this oligarchy of the living that prioritizes current efficiency over long-term redundancy?
Their social order was deliberately structured to prioritize the local common good over dependence on globalized systems, which is what failed in that broader Bronze Age international world.
So they were more self-sufficient.
Much more. They maintained self-sufficient economies centered on local resources, like specialized maritime trade and resource processing. Critically, they had redundant administrative systems to backstop failures.
Multiple points of failure.
And a political structure with integrated elites and working classes, which suggests strong internal cohesion and mutual responsibility. They focused on defense and securing their own infrastructure, particularly water supplies, rather than relying on the stability of far-flung partners.
That sounds like a powerful argument against hyper-globalization. Is the idea that we should ditch global markets entirely or just build in far more resilience at the local level?
It's the latter. It's about building redundancy, not isolation. The collapse happened because the interconnected trade routes were the single point of failure for the major centralized empires. The Phoenicians and other enduring groups survived because they had multiple points of failure built into their system. They listened to the wisdom of self-sufficiency that they'd derived from past hardships, and that enabled them to weather the storm.
Even the Greeks, whose mainland suffered catastrophic population loss, and the estimates are chillingly high, between 40 to 60% of the populace, they managed to survive in these small, hardscrabble pockets.
It's incredible.
The fact that this decimated remnant later evolved to birth our civilization just highlights that survival is not a given. It is a difficult generational feat, a hard-won continuation of a story maintained by a resilient few.
And this pragmatic resilience often allowed them to leapfrog technologically. The Cypriots and Phoenicians were at the forefront of metallurgy, and they inaugurated the Iron Age with superior metalwork, specifically iron.
The new technology.
This superior localized technology and the wealth it generated through trade allowed them to gain prestige and flourish during the Dark Ages that followed the collapse. They listened to the lessons of the past, or at least they were pragmatic enough to secure their local systems and resources, which enabled them to leap ahead during a system change.
Okay, now let's jump forward thousands of years to a historical moment where this concept of the democracy of the dead, the imperative to defend the inheritance, was made manifest in the most extreme, visceral terms, the Siege of Vienna in 1683.
A pivotal moment. This was a defense not just of a city, but of the entirety of Central and Western Europe against the Ottoman Empire. The stakes were absolute.
The Ottoman army laid siege to the city, and for 60 agonizing days, the city absorbed this relentless bombardment. An English eyewitness described the scene. He said the city had changed face from fairest and most flourishing to a hellscape littered with sewage, rubble, and corpses.
And they estimated it absorbed 1 million of cannon and musket shot. The scale is almost unimaginable.
It is. But what fueled the defenders wasn't just patriotism or a desire to hold territory. They were fighting for their spiritual and cultural existence.
They weren't just fighting for the physical walls of the city, which you can rebuild.
Exactly. They were fighting for the cathedrals, the music, the stories, the entire spiritual inheritance that their ancestors had built up over centuries. They understood that the physical structures were just containers for the sacred norms of their civilization.
And when the Polish relief force arrived, led by King Jan Sobieski in one of the largest cavalry charges in history,
Over 18,000 horsemen.
their motivation was framed entirely by this inheritance. A chronicler with the force wrote in his journal of seeing the flag still flying on St. Stephen's Cathedral as they reached the hills overlooking the devastation. He understood immediately. They were not merely relieving a city, they were saving a world.
That is the democracy of the dead in action.
It is. Those defenders and those rescuers were honoring a profound, sacred contract with their ancestors, the people who built St. Stephen's, who composed the music and curated the stories. They were willing to sacrifice the present, their own lives for the future, to ensure that their world, their inheritance, would be passed on to the unborn generation. They resisted the arrogance of the living by prioritizing continuity.
This moves the whole concept of cultural inheritance out of the museum and into the realm of existential survival. And that brings us to our final section. How protecting heritage is no longer a soft, feel-good policy goal, but a hard, strategic national security imperative today.
And this linkage is now explicitly recognized at the highest levels of governance around the world. Assistant Secretary of State Lee Satterfield and Secretary of State Anthony Blinken have both stated it very clearly. Cultural policy is security policy.
So when cultural policy is security policy, what does that actually mean?
Yeah.
It means acknowledging that safeguarding cultural heritage is crucial for promoting social cohesion within nations, strengthening diplomatic relations externally, and ensuring regional stability globally.
And it contributes directly to national cohesion and resilience, which are now seen as essential components of national security in the 21st century.
Right.
And this realization, it grew directly out of the ashes of modern conflict, particularly the aftermath of the 2003 Iraq War and the entrenched conflict against ISIL. That era provided undeniable, quantified evidence that cultural destruction and looting were not just regrettable side effects of war, but sophisticated strategic tools of war and terror finance.
The evidence was staggering. Funds generated from looting and illegal trafficking of artifacts were systematically used by insurgents in Iraq and later by ISIL to fund their terrorist activities.
Yes. Matthew Bogdanos, who led the criminal investigations in Iraq, he asserted that trafficking in antiquities ranked second as a cash source for the terrorists, behind only oil.
Second only to oil.
We also know that groups like Al-Qaeda, anticipating that their traditional bank accounts would be frozen after 9/11, sought to safeguard their finances by sinking money into a diverse, portable portfolio, which prominently included antiquities.
So they're treated as highly liquid, illicit financial assets by global terror groups. They're functionally equivalent to diamonds or gold for funding operations.
Exactly. And the scale of this illicit finance is massive. The illegal trade in antiquities is estimated to be worth billions annually, and it's closely correlated with other transnational organized crime like arms, narcotics, and human trafficking.
This isn't just a few rogue thieves. It's illicit finance on a geopolitical scale that actively destabilizes entire regions.
Moreover, groups like ISIL utilized cultural destruction like targeting religious sites, not just for profit, but as a potent propaganda vehicle. By systematically erasing the cultural and religious identity of conquered peoples, they promoted an image of absolute dominance and used it for recruiting new fighters globally. Cultural destruction becomes psychological and strategic warfare.
And the modern era has allowed us to fight back with advanced technology. During the conflicts in Iraq and Syria, the looting and destruction were documented in real time using sophisticated remote sensing technologies like satellite imagery and drones.
Right. And that monitoring capability has continued to evolve and is currently being deployed to track cultural destruction in the conflict in Ukraine.
Because of these entrenched links between cultural theft and national security threats, there's been a significant policy response globally across both hard law and soft law.
On the hard law side, the UN Security Council has acted repeatedly. Resolution 1483, adopted right after the looting of the Iraq Museum in 2003, called for all UN member states to prevent trade in illegally removed Iraqi cultural materials.
And then later, in 2015.
In 2015, Resolution 2199 called for new prohibitions on trade from Syria, and critically, it condemned the deliberate, including targeted destruction of religious sites and objects.
That condemnation of deliberate destruction, that marks a significant shift in international policy, doesn't it?
It's huge. It reflects the recognition that blowing up ancient statues or mosques isn't just a sad accident of war. It is a strategic act of aggression against the global community and a threat to stability in its own right.
And the U.S. response has involved a major increase in interagency cooperation, reflected by the establishment of the Cultural Antiquities Task Force, or CATF.
The CATF is a powerhouse coalition. It pulls together federal agencies that historically never talked about history, state, defense, homeland security, interior, justice, treasury. Their mission is unified to combat trafficking and illicit finance.
So the Cultural Antiquities Task Force is essentially the U.S. government acknowledging that fighting terror finance requires the CIA, the Treasury Department, and the Defense Department to actively talk about stolen pottery and ancient manuscripts.
It's fusing intelligence gathering with cultural preservation.
Exactly. This coordination was a direct result of the lack of collaboration that allowed trafficking to flourish after the 2003 invasion. These agencies now work together, sharing information and providing training to foreign countries with which the U.S. has cultural property agreements.
And this financial warfare extends directly into anti-money laundering legislation. We see the EU and the UK subjecting the art market, specifically transactions over 10,000 to AML regulations, recognizing the high risk of illicit finance.
The U.S. Congress followed suit, They amended the Bank Secrecy Act in 2021 to explicitly include persons engaged in the trade of antiquities as financial institutions subject to reporting
A
requirements.
huge step.
It was a critical step in specifically targeting this sector for illicit finance risks, treating the sale of antiquities with the same scrutiny as a major bank transaction.
And alongside these hard law measures, the U.S. has strategically deployed soft power through the Ambassador's Fund for Cultural Preservation, or AFCP. The AFCP is deliberately characterized as a strategic bolstering of national security policy through soft diplomatic programming. The goal is straightforward: to enhance the image of the United States abroad and promote mutual respect by demonstrating an appreciation for diverse cultures, particularly in regions that have historically viewed U.S. intervention with suspicion.
So that means projects funded by the AFCP are often strategically located in areas known for a poor history of U.S. intervention, like Iraq and Afghanistan, or in Muslim-majority countries. It's a way of saying, we respect your history, and we want to help you preserve your inheritance.
And we saw a massive, immediate strategic deployment of this fund in 2023, far surpassing the typical funding range, when the AFCP awarded $7 million to the Ukraine Cultural Heritage Response Initiative.
That wasn't just philanthropy.
Not at all. It was strategic support for an ally whose very identity is under attack.
Because the conflict in Ukraine presents a different but equally chilling strategic use of cultural heritage. Russia's justification for its aggression relies partly on the argument that Ukraine is not a distinct culture, people, or nation from Russia itself, implying they should be unified.
Therefore, Russia's strategy includes wholesale destruction and the intentional targeting of cultural sites, churches, museums, archives, not merely as collateral damage, but as a systematic effort to eradicate specific Ukrainian religious groups and ethnicities. Cultural destruction becomes strategic warfare aimed at nullifying national identity.
Tearing down the democracy of the dead so the oligarchy of the aggressor can assert total control.
Whether it is the erasure of social trust in a local community through neglect, the systemic underinvestment in future growth due to myopic political incentives, or the funding of global terrorism through looted artifacts. The invisible damage of cultural repudiation is just as profound as the physical destruction of ancient buildings. It's the loss of social capital, the severance of intergenerational identity, and the degradation of trust. All essential, quantifiable components for a functional society, for economic prosperity, and for national resilience.
What we've learned today is that the value of cultural inheritance is no longer merely aesthetic or historical. It is a critical, quantifiable component of national security, social resilience, and economic prosperity. When we systematically dismiss the wisdom and the tangible bonds passed down by previous generations, when we stop listening to the democracy of the dead, we're actively eroding the foundations of our own ability to cope with future systemic crises. The arrogant oligarchy of the living, obsessed with the fleeting vanity of the present moment, is not just discarding the past, it is manufacturing its own predictable, quantifiable collapse.